Hi, everyone. It's Natalie here. Thanks to Jesse and everyone at the No-Till Market Garden podcast for inviting me to be a guest host. When Jesse asked me to do this, I knew that I wanted the subject of PFAS to be one of my episodes, but I didn't think it would be great as a first episode because it's really not uplifting. It's one of those topics that makes it hard to keep sitting up straight because it feels sort of deflating. But I've been behind the ball on getting other episodes going, and Jesse tells me there's a lot of interest in this topic, so I decided to go for it. For the vast majority of you out there, PFAS contamination on your farms isn't going to be an issue, but it's something that people may want to be aware of when they're looking for land, when they're buying inputs like compost or straw mulch, and when they're making compost themselves with various feedstocks. So to learn more about this, I spoke with Caleb Goossen, who's the Organic Crop and Conservation Specialist at the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association. If you're interested in learning more after listening to this podcast, MOFGA has a lot of resources on their website. So here's my conversation with Caleb, and I promise there will be uplifting episodes in the future.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by Johnny's Selected Seeds. Johnny's Selected Seeds is a proud sponsor of the No-Till Market Garden podcast. Since 1973, Johnny's has supported farmers and gardeners with superior seeds, tools, and information to help ensure their growing success and help feed their communities and families. The research farm is at the heart of Johnny's, where they trial thousands of varieties and tools every year. Their breeding program uniquely focuses on introducing varieties that meet the needs or solve the challenges mixed market, small farmers, and avid gardeners face. Visit johnnyseeds.com for innovative new varieties and time-tested favorites to grow this season. You can also browse their online growers library, link in the description, for a wealth of free educational resources. The employee owners at Johnny's look forward to growing with you. Today's episode is also brought to you by Rimmel Greenhouses.
Whether it's tomatoes to market, flowers in the spring, or your family's harvest, growing in a greenhouse protected from the weather provides the right environment that you need for a harvest that you can count on. Rimmel Greenhouses are designed for durability and offer the quality that you need to grow productively year-round. Visit rimmelgreenhouses.com to get a quote today.
If I may editorialize for a second, I own a Rimmel tunnel. I love it. We built it ourselves, and I really appreciated the quality of the tunnel as well as the customer service we received in the process. So make sure to check them out. All right, back to the show.
Welcome. I'm really glad to have you here. And
Thanks.
If you could just introduce yourself and tell me what you do and how long you've been doing it, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So my name is Caleb Goossen. I'm the crop specialist for the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, which is a job that's pretty similar to, a university extension position, but instead of working for actual extension out of a university, I work for a nonprofit organization instead. So I kind of cover lots of production topics for our certified farmers here in Maine, certified organic farmers, as well as other folks who are just trying to farm organically, all the way down to some home gardener questions. And topics can kind of run the gamut from pests and diseases to soil health and fertility, to all sorts of other different production questions. And lately, the question du jour for Maine has been about PFAS contamination in agricultural production.
Yeah, and so can you talk a little bit about, before we get into PFAS? I'm from Maine. I'm very proud of the organic farming scene in Maine, and I believe it was your predecessor who was sort of the first organic extension agent in the country, right? So Maine has this really long history of organic farming, and how many organic farms are there now?
So there's a little over 500 certified operations, but that doesn't always mean farm, but it's probably a little over 400 certified farms in Maine. And yeah, my predecessor was Eric Seidman, and he was always proud to call himself the first organic extension agent. And I was sort of honored to be able to take the position as Eric was stepping down, and we had a nice overlap where he was incredibly helpful as a mentor to help me get up on my feet.
Yeah. And so Maine kind of was leading the way with organic farming, and now unfortunately Maine seems to be leading the way with PFAS. So what is PFAS? And how did this come to light in Maine, and what are the sorts of questions that you're getting now?
Yeah, so PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, which is a mouthful, which is why everybody says PFAS, and the acronym is PFAS. And it's a whole group of chemical compounds, and it depends on who's counting, because different people have counted different numbers of them, but there's between 5 and over 10,000 compounds that could be classified as PFAS. It also depends a little bit on the definition. Some federal definitions of PFAS compounds would, and this is where we're going to get into the chemistry that I know can lose all of us, myself included sometimes, but where on a molecule, if you think about carbon chains or carbon rings, if one in the federal definition, some of them, if 2 of those carbon atoms are fully fluorinated, meaning that they've got a lot of fluorine atoms chemically bound to them, then that makes it a per or polyfluoroalkyl substance. Here in Maine, the definition that our state legislature set was just 1 carbon atom has to be fully fluorinated to consider it a PFAS compound. So in that background, just know that what that really means is there's thousands of different potential substances that could be considered PFAS. In our day-to-day, it's probably more like hundreds that we're encountering. And then for agricultural contamination, a lot of the attention is on the compounds that were sort of invented first and used earliest, starting in like the 50s, and therefore they've been around longest. We know the most about their impacts on human health, and they also are the most widespread and dispersed because they were used so much for so long that they've kind of made their way around the environment.
And sometimes they're called forever chemicals, and why is that? Obviously, you said they've been around since the 1950s.
Yeah, so they're called forever chemicals because the fluorine-carbon bond, that chemical bond, as far as chemistry is concerned, that as a single bond between a carbon and a fluorine is the strongest single carbon bond you can have in chemistry. It is incredibly difficult to pull those atoms apart. So if we think about other contaminants, they're often degrade. There's non-living ways they can degrade from sunlight and things like that, but a lot of them are degraded by bacteria and maybe fungi in the soil and in the water. And often it's because the bacteria is getting energy from breaking apart these molecules. With a PFAS compound, that at least that fluorinated section is going to be so difficult for the bacteria to break apart that they're not going to get any more energy out of it than they would get than they would have to expend. In other words, the juice isn't worth the squeeze.
Yeah.
So they just don't get broken down by microbes, and they're also stable from other sources of degradation like UV light and things like that.
Yeah, so you can't just compost these things that have PFAS in them and then have the PFAS be gone.
Yeah, and it's one of those things. This might come up later, but if you were to have something that had a lot of PFAS in it, in a organic matter that had a lot of PFAS contamination, and you composted that, well, think about the organic matter in the composting process. Some of that's going to be broken down and respired away as carbon dioxide. So in effect, what's left behind are the parts that don't break down, as well as many other things, because composting's complicated. But that PFAS won't be broken down, so it'll get kind of concentrated in the final product a little bit.
So can you give us a little of the history? I think for a lot of people listening, this is completely new. And I know you and I are both from Maine, and so it's not, but can you give us a little of the history of how this came to be discovered as an issue in Maine for farmers?
Yeah, and I should also probably start off by saying it's not going to just be an issue in Maine, and it already has become is an issue elsewhere in the country and in the world. For the most part, it's kind of blowing up here in Maine because a few events happened that caused Maine to really start investigating it. And wherever they look, they seem to be finding PFAS. So I'll go into what happened here in Maine, but just as a little background and kind of zooming out, there is low-level PFAS contamination probably all over the globe, in all the oceans, even on ice caps and the top of Mount Everest and things like that, because it can get airborne. It can deposit from the atmosphere a little bit, and that's going to be what's considered background contamination, background levels. So there's a little bit. And then there's also a bit in all of our homes and in our own bodies. And therefore, as it passes through us, it goes into our waste stream. And that's gonna come in key here. So what happened with Maine, that a water district did some routine testing of some of their wells, because they have some monitoring wells for their water source. And PFAS compounds, particularly two that are going to come up the most, that are probably the best known for their impacts on human health and the best studied, are PFOA and PFOS. And the EPA, the federal EPA, had some guidance suggesting levels of PFOA and PFOS that were, in drinking water that would be considered concerning. And that was guidance that they gave to all the states and all the water districts. It wasn't regulatory. It was just sort of you should probably try to be below this level. And that was about 70 parts per trillion. At this site, they found levels that were concerning, and I don't remember the specific numbers. So then they started to wonder, why was that well contaminated? And they traced it to a dairy farm nearby. The well was maybe even on the dairy farm's land. And so then the question was, why was this dairy farm contaminated? And they figured out that it was from sludge spreading. So what had sludge or biosolids is essentially the solids that are left after wastewater is treated and composted typically. So this farmer had been taking advantage of a program where you could get biosolids as a soil amendment, a soil conditioner, a fertility amendment, and had done that for many years. And eventually the low levels in that sludge had built up to contaminate their land. So then the realization was that land was contaminated. The feed being grown on the land was contaminated, the water was contaminated, and therefore the cows that were eating the feed, drinking the water, were also getting contaminated, and their milk was contaminated. So that was concerning. That led a series of investigations. I think this started in about 2016, and then over the next few years, these investigations ramped up. And so they did some off-the-shelf testing where they just sort of tested milk on grocery store shelves, essentially, and looked for high levels of some of these PFAS compounds, and high being a really relative term, and we can kind of talk about what concentrations are concerning later. But on the grand scheme of things, it's a very small amount, but it doesn't take much for it to get concerning. Mm-hmm. So they found levels that were concerning in these milk, and they kind of traced them. Okay, which milk route essentially did it come from? Testing milk trucks, and then they identified two more dairy farms that had high levels, and those were elsewhere in the state of Maine. Mm-hmm. But they had also had a lot of sludge applications over the years, a lot of biosolids.
And we should say that this was encouraged. It's not like these farmers were doing anything wrong. This was actually a practice that was encouraged all over.
Yes, and it's at the moment it was just made illegal here in Maine, but it's still encouraged around the country because, on the face of it, it's seemingly a great idea, right? The concerns have always been maybe heavy metals or bacteria in essentially wastewater or sewage, and you wouldn't want that on your growing land, clearly. Mm-hmm. So there's an EPA program on the federal level, and then all the states kind of have their own guidance and regulations. And typically the concern has always been around the heavy metals and the potential for bacterial contamination. And so lots of farms take advantage of these programs, and they're usually given lots of encouragement and the guarantee that this is safe because it's been tested for heavy metals, it's been tested for bacteria. What no one thought about was the PFAS that was coming through. And it is coming through in all sludge sources just because there are PFAS in our own bodies. And so therefore our own waste streams have some PFAS. But then these later farms that were found to be heavily contaminated were getting sludge from a specific wastewater district that was also receiving industrial waste. So there was I think they were making paper plates or something like that, where they were applying a PFAS coating to the product. And that was also going off in their wastewater, which was going to this wastewater district. And then if they had solids left over from their manufacturing process, they would get sort of co-composted with the biosolids from the wastewater district. So all in all, that specific source of biosolids was heavily contaminated.
And the reason the paper plates had it was because this compound that they were using is kind of a grease repellent, or it gives the paper plates like that sort of waxiness. Is that right?
Yeah, I should probably have taken a step back in talking about what PFAS compounds are and to say why they're so common. Is that they are incredibly useful. They're handy. So if they, in the perfect world, had no health impacts, they would probably be the bee's knees. But they're often used anywhere for their water repellency, stain repellency, grease repellency. Teflon pans, those are usually PFAS compounds, Teflon tape. There's so many products. Waterproof mascara is one that often surprises people. If you use the kind of dental floss that really glides between your teeth, that is a Teflon product. That is PFAS compounds on it. Fast food packaging typically has a lot of PFAS coatings to make that grease not soak through. And so these paper plates were coated so that they wouldn't get soggy and that the grease wouldn't soak through.
And can I stop you too? I know this is just such a big topic, but and we will get more to sort of the what's next, what to do, but what is the data on the health effects of PFAS showing?
Yeah, so it's the big headline is more data is needed, but some of the compounds that have been around longer have been better studied, and I'll throw out the caveat that I'm not a doctor. I don't research this typically, but from what I've read, there are potential impacts on liver enzymes. There's some potential links to kidney cancer, testicular cancer. One of the health impacts that's driving a lot of the new guidance on what levels in our bodies may be harmful is about immune response in children. So if children are exposed to a lot of certain PFAS compounds, I'm not sure which ones have been linked, then they may receive a vaccine and actually not develop the immunity that they're supposed to be developing if the levels in their blood are high enough. Some other ones are, I think, low birth weight, high cholesterol. So there's several health impacts, and those are the ones that are best studied. One of the tricky parts is, and why Maine is looking at this as a class of compounds, is that the PFOA and the PFOS that I talked about that are sort of best known, those have mostly been phased out of production, at least here in the US. I think they're still produced abroad. But they are they were phased out in the 2000s for the large part because the data was coming out that they had health impacts. But the industries that want to apply these coatings, they have essentially just sort of substituted different compounds that are slightly different chemistries. PFOA and PFOS are 8 carbon chains, and they've maybe substituted some that are 6 carbon chains or 4 carbon chains, but otherwise similar compounds. And then there's just so many more that if you were to look at it one compound at a time, you would never catch up because they could always just sort of switch their inputs to produce a different compound.
Yeah. So more data needed on the health effects. We just don't know, but there's definitely some evidence that these aren't compounds that, we want in high concentrations in our water and our food and our soil.
Yeah. So some of the reason why the concerns are about really low levels, really low contamination, is that a lot of these compounds don't leave our bodies very quickly. And so if you think of your body as sort of a bathtub, right, and everything you eat and drink as filling up the bathtub and going to the bathroom as emptying the bathtub, the PFAS, at least PFOA and PFOS, stick around in our bodies for years as the half-life, in maybe 6 years, about half of what you ingest today will be gone, but you'll still have the other half still in your body. So if you are continually taking it in, it just builds up and up and up. And over time, you can get concerning levels.
And so I think most of the growers listening are organic or follow organic practices. And according to the organic standards, you're not allowed to spread sludge or biosolids or residuals or whatever you want to call it, anything stemming from human waste on your field. So why is this a problem for organic farmers? Not that we should only be concerned about organic farmers, but why is this an issue?
Yeah, I've had a lot of people asking, how did this happen on some organic farms? And the long story short is that the organic standards are written with agricultural compounds in mind. So if you think about the organic rules do say that you could transition a conventionally managed field into organic production, but you couldn't call it certified organic for 3 years. You would have to use organic practices for 3 years before you could sell anything from it as organic. And that works really well for something like, glyphosate, right? Roundup, which wouldn't be allowed in organic production. 3 years later, it's going to be mostly broken down. It's going to be really hard to find. Apologize for my clock. It's going to be really hard to find traces of glyphosate in an organic crop, a certified organic crop, after it hasn't been applied for at least 3 years to that field. But because these compounds don't break down, and they were never expected to be showing up in these fields in the first place, that timeline couldn't really work for them. And honestly, there isn't really any look back period that would be particularly effective unless you were to go back, before they were ever applied, and that kind of stretches what's practical to do. So some of the farms that have found problems, including some vegetable operations, these solids weren't spread on vegetable fields. They were spread primarily on dairy fields, hay fields, corn fields. and then the farm may have changed hands. And in some of these cases, it's that farms have changed hands a couple times. So by the time somebody has bought their farm and they've converted to organic production and they've been producing organic vegetables for years and years, they may have no idea that there were PFAS compounds applied inadvertently, accidentally, through sludge spreading. Another source that has happened for some farms, one farm that I've worked with didn't have any solid spread on the fields that they grow on, but there were solid spread on the neighboring parcel. And one of the real tricky things with PFAS compounds is that they stick in the soils, some of them more so than others, but they also leach through the soils and go right into waterways and groundwater. So this farm had relatively low levels in their soil, but very high contamination in their irrigation water. And that was producing contaminated crops.
And is that typically the easiest way to determine if there is PFAS contamination through the water sampling, or is it through soil sampling or crop sampling?
Just in terms of, well, so the sampling for PFAS compounds, because again we're talking about really low concentrations, is very expensive. So if you think about testing your water source, that's one test. And it kind of covers all of your production, versus some farm that maybe has many fields that have been managed differently. That would be a lot of different soil samples. The other thing is that if your soil was contaminated and you were and you had groundwater available to sample, then it's not necessarily going to be a direct correlation. But if your groundwater tests high, it certainly is going to suggest you should be testing the soil as well. So it's sort of, I recommend it as the best first step, right? You know, when we've talked with farms about how to sort of evaluate their risks, we said, first of all, look and see if spreading was done on your land. And I know many places that's not going to be easy to do, but, you know, talk to the previous landowners, talk to neighbors. Here in Maine, because this investigation into the PFAS contamination through sludge has grown, the legislature mandated the Department of Environmental Protection here in Maine, which is the same agency that approved the spreading of sludge, to make a map of all the sites where Class B biosolids had been applied. And so it's not a perfect one-to-one, you know, just because somebody's on a map doesn't mean that they're contaminated in a concerning manner. Also, there's probably sites that are not going to show up on the map, either because records didn't exist, or they potentially were spreading Class A biosolids instead of Class B. And only Class B were the ones that were required to have records kept.
So there are probably a lot of fields out there that did have biosolid applications, and at this point, you know, those people who knew the history may actually be gone.
Yes, there's certainly that potential. Another source of contamination that is common around the country, unfortunately, is from military bases, airports, or anywhere where firefighting training was happening. Because one of the uses of PFAS compounds is in aqueous firefighting film or foam. And so if you think about anywhere where they were concerned about a very high temperature petroleum fire, like say jet fuel, they had this foam on hand. And of course, even if they didn't need to use it, they needed to do practice drills and things like that. So many military sites and airports and firefighting training sites have contaminated nearby waterways. And so that can then, again, contaminate irrigation as well as drinking water. We're talking about the context of, you know, food production, but for the typical consumer, as well as for farmers, the most concerning pathway for your own health is if your water is contaminated. then food is probably secondary.
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is brought to you by BCS America. BCS two-wheel tractors are designed and built in Italy, where small-scale farming has been a way of life for generations. Discover the beauty of BCS on your farm with PTO-driven implements for soil working, shredding cover crops, spreading compost, mowing under fences, clearing snow, and much more, all powered by a single gear-driven machine that's tailored to the size and scale of your operation. We have been using a BCS tractor on our farm since 2014, and it has saved the day and leveled the workload more times than I can count. And I find new ways to employ it every single season. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. To learn more, view sale pricing, or locate your nearest dealer, visit bcsamerica.com. That's bcsamerica.com. And while you're there, select tractors and attachments on sale through the end of this year.
Transition your mind, your skills, and your future to organic with the University of Wisconsin-Madison's brand new certificate in organic agriculture. Students will explore the organic world from the soil to the store shelf with lots of stops along the way. We'll dig into policy, production, agroecology, supply chains, and much more. Whatever your interest, we'll work with you to fold organics into it. Learn more at uworganic.wisc.edu. The world is going organic. Now you can too.
All right, back to the show.
And what is the extent, obviously this is still kind of in the beginning, but what is the extent of concerning contamination on Maine farms? And like you said, this is not a Maine problem. This is a national and a global problem. It's just that Maine is sort of ahead in, uncovering it.
Yeah, so there's 2 dairy farms that have stopped production, which, in the grand scheme of things is good for public health because that's 2 sources of high contamination that are removed from the food system. But then there are several other farms. There's some vegetable farms that halted production, one that has not restarted, and the other ones that have restarted production, and they're doing so with lots of testing and some mitigation in place to make sure that the levels in the produce are safe levels. And I know that sounds weird. If it's so concerning at low levels, how can there be any safe levels? But the reality is, if you had the laboratory ability to test at the greatest sensitivity, you would find these compounds kind of in everything at some level. It would just be really tiny. And so it just becomes a question of how much is too much and how things like that. Mm-hmm. In all, I think the last number I had heard was about 14 affected farms that had at least paused sales. There are likely to be more as the investigation unfurls, as well as we get better understandings of what level is a concerning level. One of the big things that is pretty important in sort of evaluating this risk, at least here in Maine, and I imagine will be important as folks start to look into this elsewhere, is really providing a safety net for the farms, because the original dairy farmer or whatever farmer that applied the biosolids certainly wasn't contaminating things intentionally, and whoever is managing that land now certainly isn't trying to produce contaminated food. And so in order to kind of make them feel safe enough to do the testing, to evaluate their own needs, they really need to know that there's a safety net that will help recoup lost sales, and in the worst case scenario, recoup the value of the land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which brings me to a question. I guess we already talked a little bit about kind of what to do if you're looking to buy land, and just ask around, maybe even test the well water, see what the history is of the land. What about farms? I know a lot of the listeners to this podcast are practicing no-till, and they're using a lot of compost, and sometimes that compost is produced on the farm from, external inputs. They're getting waste from other places, and sometimes it's just purchased externally. The compost is made somewhere else. What should farmers be thinking about when they're looking for either a compost supply or compost feedstocks?
Yeah, so it gets tricky. And of course, just the sheer volume of different types of compost and different people making compost with different recipes and different sources, it's going to have to be sort of individualized. But some overarching themes that might be helpful. I know when I'm talking with farmers that want to buy compost from a dedicated compost producer, I've been encouraging them to request that producer give them a PFAS test results instead of the farmer trying to send them off. Because again, this testing is very expensive, and just for the efficiency's sake, let's have the person who wants to sell the compost do the testing once and make sure that their recipe and their supply of feedstocks is safe enough, instead of everybody reinventing the wheel and testing the same compost again and again. This will also sort of give the suppliers of agricultural inputs sort of that signal that their purchasers need this information. Just like, that if you were talking about heavy metals, it wouldn't be out of the ordinary for you to maybe ask the supplier of your fertility input if there was a test for heavy metals like arsenic or lead or something like that. That being said, it's tricky to get this testing done. It's tricky to get it done to interpret the results at the moment. But you can maybe kind of get just a number that you can then find somebody to ask and say, is this a lot or is this a little? Mm-hmm. And it also boils down to a bit of how much you're using. So, if you're just doing a little bit of compost application in maybe a more conventional tillage operation versus deep compost mulch, that would be a vast difference in quantity that you're actually applying. So heavily contaminated compost with a heavy application would potentially be concerning. That's when you would probably want to evaluate things a little more closely. So one of the things to think about is just what are the different feedstocks in the compost. What we're seeing in terms of plant uptake of these compounds is that it tends to be greatest in the leaf tissue, the leaf and the stem tissue. So if it's made with a lot of bedding that has hay or straw, that was grown on heavily contaminated land, then you would expect it to bring some contamination with it. If it was being made with manure from dairy cows or horses that were fed heavily contaminated hay, or corn silage, then you would expect that manure to potentially have a lot of contamination. More so, assuming that the urine, most of these compounds are excreted through urine. So if the urine's part of that bedding, that manure, which I think is typically where it ends up, then that could carry some contamination with it. Harder to think about, harder to know. So that's going to be a bit of a question, right? Where does the manure come from if it's manure based? And then what contamination level is there? And most farmers, I think, are not going to have even thought to ask that question. So it's going to be hard to get answers on this right away. Some other concerns would be food-based compost. There is an EPA document. It's very long and boring, but it has some numbers on composts that indicate that food waste-based compost is going to have some PFAS coming through. Mm-hmm. It's going to be much worse if that compost is made with packaging. So if it has biodegradable packaging, just because it's quote unquote biodegradable doesn't mean it didn't have a PFAS treatment applied to it, mm-hmm. a coating. Mm-hmm. And so composts that have been made with that food packaging tend to have a lot higher PFAS in the final product.
And what about things that like sometimes people add things like cardboard, pizza boxes, stuff like that?
Yeah. Well, so pizza boxes would be concerning because they are more likely to have a PFAS compound. Again, think of greasy pizza. A lot of, you might have a liner inside that pizza box that had a PFAS coating to be grease proof. Fast food packaging in general, anything that, should be oily and greasy and soaked through, but isn't, probably had a PFAS coating, although several companies are starting to change their product, their packaging. So those types of materials would potentially be concerning. Cardboard is really tricky. If it were virgin fiber cardboard, if they had just cut down the papers and processed it and applied no treatments, it's probably fine. If it's got recycled content, well, then you have to start wondering what types of paper products went into that recycling pool of feedstock that they made the recycled cardboard out of. And a lot of those paper products do have PFAS coatings on them. I haven't seen data on like how much of a concern this is. I just know that there's some potential. So unfortunately, all these things that, are the right things to do, right? Like recycle, grass-fed dairy, there's some more potential for a little more PFAS flow through in that system.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not to get too sidetracked, but I find the whole thing really sad because thinking back to like Sir Albert Howard and the law of the return, one of his big things was we need to return our waste to the soil. And fundamentally, from a nutrient and organic matter standpoint, we really do. And so it's really sad that this contamination is happening and it's kind of disrupting our ability to do that.
Yeah, I was very torn as the Maine legislature was debating what they eventually passed into law, which is prohibiting the soil application of biosolids, because it's been, this history has devastated a lot of farms and it's clearly become an issue. But in my idealistic brain, I'm like, no, that needs to happen at some point, right?
Yeah.
We have to take these nutrients that we're feeding people with and return them back to the agricultural system. But we have, unfortunately, sort of fundamentally broken it by contaminating the whole system. And we're just talking about PFAS. I think in some ways, this is I don't want to be misinterpreted here. Clearly, the PFAS contamination has been pretty horrible for the farms that are affected and anybody that has been impacted from their own well water and their own food supply. In some ways, it does give me a little bit of hope because the way Maine is handling it is the group of compounds. And so instead of, there's another law that has been passed that by 2030, products that have PFAS intentionally added will no longer be allowed for sale in Maine. I'm not entirely sure how that's going to play out because so many products have PFAS intentionally added to them.
Yeah.
But, fingers crossed it plays out well. And there are some exemptions for really important things that can't be avoided, like medical devices. But assuming that plays out well, that is going to be one way to prevent PFAS compounds of all types from entering our system here in Maine and the waste stream, apart from, the regular sort of broad spread contamination of like atmospheric deposition from air pollution from elsewhere. But there's some potential there to regulate it as a class of compounds. And I know folks who know chemistry are going to say, well, just because, something's fluorinated doesn't necessarily mean it will have health impacts. And they're probably right. But if we're just sort of knocking down compound by compound, it's really fast for
it's whack-a-mole.
producers.
Yeah.
It's whack-a-mole. You can just switch to a new compound, and it's going to take decades before the health impacts are known.
Yeah.
Whereas we're setting ourselves up here in Maine to maybe somebody will be able to demonstrate that this specific PFAS compound has no health impacts, and therefore will be allowed. I don't know that they've got a mechanism in place in the law for that yet, but that is sort of the way it maybe should be done. Unlike so many other contaminants that are in our bodies and in our waste stream right now, which are also going through that sludge, right? Like so many folks have stopped using BPA, but they just replaced it with BPB or BPC or fill in the blank. And there's so many other, additives to plastics and plasticizers and et cetera, things that are hard to even think about for too long.
Yeah. So Maine, that is really hopeful. Maine is sort of forcing a precautionary principle approach. Yeah. And it's neat to think that other states could do the same thing, creating more of a market for alternative products that don't contain, I suppose producers could say, oh, Maine, you only have 1.3 million people. We're just not going to send you any products. But if enough states say, no, we won't take these products at all, then producers will have to come up with alternatives.
Yeah, and there's sort of two ways that's going to play out. One is, the products, the general products entering the marketplace, and that's, everything we buy at the store. But then the other thing that Maine is doing that hasn't been done in most of the country is setting screening thresholds for food. Because, once it was found in that milk from that dairy, the question became, well, what's a safe level in milk? And there was a screening threshold that was calculated, and they're in the process of finalizing a recalculation of that for milk and beef. They also have a screening threshold for fish, and these have all been calculated by the Maine CDC, not the federal CDC, but the Maine state CDC and their team of toxicologists. And so they're kind of saying this level in milk or meat, in beef, or fill in the blank for the food product, because they're working on more of these screening thresholds, and they're going to start releasing some for vegetables. That these levels are going to be considered safe enough, and that's always tricky territory. I was a little concerned, but in hearing how they've calculated it, they're essentially taking some guidance of what's the maximum safe level for daily intake, and it's, don't quote me on this exact number, but somewhere around 2 nanograms per kilogram of body weight per day. And saying, okay, if your water, what level in drinking water, given a 90th percentile intake of drinking water per day, will give that 2 nanograms per kilogram per body weight per day for the average child or the average adult. And this is on a compound by compound basis. So they're setting thresholds for PFOS and PFOA. And those have been the primary concerning ones. Now that there's a little bit more federal guidance coming out about what are safe levels of that intake, how many nanograms per kilogram of body weight per day, for a few other PFAS compounds, they're going to also be releasing those. So what that means is, it gives us guidance. So now a farmer that has some soil contamination or water contamination can test their produce or their food crops and say this is under that level or this is over that level, and know better what to do. But I imagine it won't be long before folks all over the globe, let alone just the country, are going to start looking at those screening thresholds and start applying them to food near them. Because It's based off of, federal data saying that the 90% of the country, this is only 10% of the country drinks more than this much milk per day. And so therefore this level in milk is going to be considered safe. So that's going to be true of milk anywhere in the country.
Yeah. So Maine is setting some standards, and other states and other countries can use those as guidelines, and I'm sure it will continue to change. And that question of like, okay, well, even if I ask my compost provider, can you get your compost tested and tell me the PFAS concentrations? Well, what do you even do with that information? I think this is still a big unknown. And like you said, well, it depends how much you're planning to add. So yeah, there's a lot out there, but I think it's just something for people to be thinking about. It's a really unfortunate thing for people to have to be thinking about, because it just stinks and it's sad, but it's better for people to know about this before they do something with, all the best intentions. Like you're going to buy a farm and you find this amazing piece of land, and, all right, well, 10 years ago, maybe there's somebody spread sludge. Oh, whatever. It's just this beautiful piece of land. And I know people that's happened to. And it's better to know ahead of time and to consider that when you're making your decisions, rather than to end up in the situation of finding out that, things are contaminated.
Yeah. And I should say there are some bright spots. One is, if say the farms that don't have much in the soil, but they do have heavily contaminated water, well, it's a lot easier to clean up the water than it is to clean up the soil. So there is some hope there, right? That water filtration could be applied. It's not to say that filtering the quantities of water needed for irrigation is easy, but it's going to be easier to get clean water than it is to get clean soil if the soil is heavily contaminated.
And we may find that there are certain crops that do not accumulate it, so it is perfectly safe to grow.
Yes, and we already know that in a general sense, again, lots more research needed, but in general, fruit crops and root crops tend to be less of a concern. So carrots, beets, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, less concerning. There was one heavily contaminated farm with heavily contaminated soil and heavily contaminated water where even their greenhouse tomato did test high enough that, it's maybe a concern, but I'm not sure. Until they get that screening threshold figured out, then that we'll get a better understanding. They also did get some in, I forget if it was squash or a melon. So in a really contaminated situation, it's still some risk, but nowhere near the concern as with like greens, whereas lettuce, kale, that is much more concerning. So it's going to vary crop by crop. And I know that's not what everybody wanted to hear, because I know greens can be a profit center for a lot of farms.
Yeah.
But this also needs to be taken with the broader context that most of the farms that have been doing this evaluation here in Maine, that have been testing their water, are getting either non-detects or really, really low readings, which are probably like background level. And they're going to be able to just continue as normal and maybe evaluate their amendments that they were going to be bringing in a little more closely as we sort of figure out this overall food system and where things are contaminated and where they're not. So I think there's some background contamination that's everywhere. There's some really heavily contaminated spots, here in Maine, that was from sludge that came with heavy contamination from a specific industry. There are some other spots in the country where there were factories, Michigan, Colorado, New Mexico, the other spots where there's contamination from where firefighting foam was used. But then everywhere else is going to probably be shades of gray. And I imagine most of that's going to be that lighter shade of gray where it's just, closer to background levels. But there's going to be some where, more research is needed to figure out when it's a problem or not.
Yeah. I'm curious whether if pyrolysis eliminates these compounds.
So it's a good question, and it's one I've been wondering. I've been hoping to get a better answer.
Okay.
When I asked somebody complete combustion, full combustion in there's that clock again. So complete combustion, and a dedicated incineration facility meant for incinerating waste, in theory, will destroy PFAS compounds if everything's working correctly. And the person who told me this was a USDA employee who had done some work in this area in the past. And they told me, yeah, if everything's working correctly, it should be eliminated. But if things aren't working correctly, some can go up the smokestack and some can go out in the ash. So what that suggests to me is that with pyrolysis, making charcoal, you're probably not going to remove all of it. And I don't know, that's not me saying you're not removing any of it, but I'm just guessing that you're probably not removing all of it. And I would really love to know more information on that because lots of people are curious about it.
Yeah. I was always hoping that biochar would be a silver bullet, but sounds like there's no such thing as a silver bullet.
Yeah, that does get into some of the many questions. People say, like, what about bioremediation? What about phytoremediation? What about mycoremediation? And if folks don't know those terms, bioremediation is sort of all-encompassing, but for our purposes, let's say that means bacterial breakdown. And we already covered why bacteria are not going to break down these compounds. Mycoremediation, fungal breakdown, is similarly not going to work real well. Phytoremediation is using plants, and I'm sure there's lots more research being done, and hopefully somebody will surprise me with some good information. I don't think there's going to be much degradation or changing of the compounds. Some of the really short chain ones maybe can be volatilized and go off into the atmosphere, but again, that's not necessarily taking care of the problem, except for in the soil. It's just putting it into the atmosphere and diluting it out to the rest of the world. But the real approach there would probably be harvesting that biomass of that plant and removing it from the site.
Yeah.
And the amount that plants take up, on a heavily contaminated site, they are taking up, a certain amount of what's in the soil, but it would take, I would say on the short end, probably hundreds of years to clean up a site, probably thousands of years of, ideal yields. So you'd have to be putting a lot of effort in to fertilize a crop, grow it, harvest it, and remove it. And then you are left with the question of what do you do with that contaminated biomass?
What about the sort of sorption dynamics of these chemicals? Meaning, like, if a lot of chemicals kind of stick to other organic molecules in the soil so that they're not actually taken up by plants. Because you can think about phytoremediation. Well, that's when plants, take up the compound and then you move it away. But what about the opposite, basically making it so that plants are not going to take up those compounds? Is there any evidence about that? Like keeping it in place, it's there, but it's just not gonna contaminate your food.
So this is falling squarely in a lot more research is needed, but there are some potential avenues to look into. So in general, all of these PFAS compounds are negatively charged, but they're not like as small as an anion. But if we think about our soil fertility and how nitrate goes through soil, unless there's a lot of good organic matter to maybe catch it, these negatively charged ones are not going to stick to your cation exchange from your clay particles. So a lot of the compounds do leach through. Some of them get bound up a little bit more. PFOS is one that tends to get stuck in the soil a little more, whereas PFOA, same chain length, but it tends to flush through and go closer into the water more quickly. Mm-hmm. There's some evidence that higher organic matter soils are going to bind them a little bit more. So increasing your organic matter is maybe going to lock them up a little bit, and that's kind of one of the mitigation techniques for lead as well, right? Mm-hmm. If you have lead in your soil, more organic matter can kind of immobilize it or bind it up at least over some length of time. Of course, as that organic matter breaks down, it releases it again, and so there's lots of good questions of how much gets bound up, how long is it bound up, and so there's some good questions about biochar. This is where biochar may be part of the solution. You're adding a lot of binding sites. And if you were to add that to soil, are you hopefully slowing the rate at which these PFAS compounds could enter the soil pore solution, the water solution in the soil pores, and then go into plant roots from there? Mm-hmm. Lots more research needed for sure.
Yeah. Well, cool.
I wish I could say definitively that was the way to go, but I just don't know. And also there's a time component. So charcoal carbon filters are the cheapest, easiest way to filter these out of water. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason to maybe use your carbon filter on your water system. Even if it's not rated for PFAS, there's a better chance that it's going to catch something than not. But once those carbon filters get saturated, you then see a spike in the water because they then start to release it.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Okay.
So would that happen in the soil over a certain amount of time? I don't know. But it's enough that I would hesitate. I wouldn't want to recommend it to anybody right away. Mm-hmm. So, and that's also a good reminder, change your filters.
Right. Oh, yeah. Well, it's been really interesting talking to you. I know it's not uplifting, but it's good to hear about these things. And I'm sorry that this has turned into such a large part of your job. I imagine you were anticipating more questions about Colorado potato beetles and all that kind of stuff, and not doing so much with PFAS.
Yes. I mail out a regular pest report, and anybody that receives it may have noticed this year it went out about a month later into the season than it normally would have. I've been a bit behind on things, but it seems to be important, and I'm wowed by some of our organic farmers that have really been very public, trying to elevate the issue to maintain consumer confidence, maintain the relationship with their customers, as well as just, I think organic farmers tend to be environmentally minded and health conscious to begin with. And so they're kind of saying like, oh, wow, this needs to be paid attention to. So there's been some really impressive farmers that have gone above and beyond to make themselves the public face of this, which has really been, I can only imagine, very difficult to have to do, especially while still processing the fact that their own diet has been contaminated and their own wells have been contaminated.
Yeah.
It's a little frustrating, but there's always, look at the people that are trying to help. And I think that's that famous Mr. Rogers quote. And there are some pretty impressive stories as well. Yeah.
All right, Caleb. Thanks for chatting.
Yeah.
Talk soon.
Thanks for having me. See you later.
Bye. All right. Thanks again to Caleb for speaking with me about this topic, and to MOFGA for all the work they're doing on raising awareness and trying to help those affected farmers. They do have a fund for affected farmers, so if you're feeling like you want to chip in something, you can go to MOFGA.org. That's MOFGA.org. And they also have a lot more resources on that website if you're interested. I've got some fun and interesting guests coming up for the next few episodes, so stay tuned. I promise I'm not all doom and gloom. All right. Bye, everybody.
Hey, you all, Farmer Jesse here, just jumping in real quick to drop some news and shout outs before you go. First, the news is that we have brought the beloved No-Till Growers Forum back online in a slightly different format where you can embed videos and post photos and all those good things. You can ask technical farming questions, post tools for sale, job or collaboration opportunities, discuss trends, whatever growing stuff you'd like. You can find the forum at no-tillgrowers.com. We will also put a link in the show notes. This forum, like everything we do, is free and open to the public. We do not do paywalls for any of our videos or podcasts or anything else. So if you appreciate that and want to support our work, you can buy a hat, a No-Till Growers hat. That's right, they're back. For sale at no-tillgrowers.com, or a copy of the Living Soil Handbook, the proceeds of which from that sale at no-tillgrowers.com go to making you more content like this. Or lastly, you can always become a Patreon member at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs this week to these amazing folks: Steve Barnett, Bill Fitch, Stephen Smith, Jason Ruel, Scott Roser, and Bill Altman. Thank you to everyone who supports our show and our work in whatever way that you can. And that's it for me. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you next week.